This is good. Right. So, yes, thank you very much for having me back. And yeah, Belinda's absolutely right. This is my 159 speaking engagements, and 7 of them have been for McIntyre. And most significantly, my very first one was for McIntyre in Derby back in 2015. First time I'd ever spoken about my autism to a group of completely new people before. Yeah, it was a very substantial, big thing for me. And my second one ever was a few months later, also for McIntyre down in Oxford. So it's yeah, it's always nice to be speaking for the basically the people who kind of launched my speaking career. So yeah, that's why I was very, very quick to say yes when Sonia invited me. So this time, going to talk a bit about autism and employment, because, well, you may have noticed, but employment rates aren't exactly very friendly for autistic people, and so I'll go into gratuitous amounts of detail in a bit. But for starters, for anyone who doesn't know who I am, I should probably introduce myself. Yep, I'm Chris. I used to be a primary school teacher in a previous life. I then left that when I realised how much mainstream education sucks, and I then, yeah, having left teaching forever for the first time, I later kind of went back into teaching, and guess what? That started with McIntyre. A former colleague of mine started working for McIntyre and said, "Well, I know you kind of miss the whole building people up side of teaching, and we have." We have a couple of teenagers who need some maths tuition. Would you be up for it? And then McIntyre led to another contact, and another contact led to another contact. And before I knew it, I was a teacher in a school again. For it is an autism specific special school. So yeah, thanks again to McIntyre for being the people who led me back into teaching. But I've left teaching forever the second time, and this time I mean it. But last year, when Autism Not Weird was taken off so well that I basically needed to turn it into full-time work. Autism Not Weird being a website and a Facebook page where I talk about autism both from a personal perspective. I can't remember whether or not I mentioned I'm autistic, but trust me, I am. And also a professional perspective as an autistic former teacher of autistic students. So yeah, that's a bit about me. I'm also a novelist. For anyone curious about what the I don't mean to brag, Belinda, but I've got all 3, and and I've just finished reading the grand finale to my parents, like reading a chapter every dinner every day, so they know the 4th book is the final one where the war comes to an end, and they now know how it ends. And I'll just say they need a bit of time to recover. But a little bit of an introduction to it. The whole of Britain's been imprisoned in these giant walled cities, and they're under the watchful eye of a million-ish clone soldiers, and there are only 13 people free in the abandoned countryside fighting back to free the general population, and most of them are teenagers who escaped an attack on their special school. So you've got autistic heroes and dyslexic heroes, and fears of ADHD, PDA, anxiety, Down syndrome, and so on, and they're the ones fighting to free the mainstream population. So there. Anyway, so autism and how to make the workplace work. Well, I suppose I'd better start off by giving you a couple of depressing statistics. So, first off, did you know 16% of autistic adults were in full-time employment? Now, I was quite good in the education system because I was the one thing in the 1990s in the education system that truly mattered. I was clever. I was also weird as hell, and so I was socially inappropriate to the point of genuine concern, but I was very clever. And I had no sensory issues either, which meant I was autistic in mainstream education, and I totally got away with it. So I went to university, studied maths, and as I often say, yes, I have a maths degree, but I promise I have a personality. But despite getting a mathematics degree and qualifying as a teacher, right up until I was around 30 and started doing autism advocacy, I'd spent probably less than, probably around 16% of my adult years being part of that 16%. And yeah, you'll hear a lot of toffee-nosed people saying, oh, well, that's largely because a lot of autistic people are disabled, surely. But we aren't talking about people like you, Chris. And yeah, I don't want to go off on a tangent really, really early about how problematic it is to assume that high functioning means no problems and low functioning means all of the problems. Um, yeah, okay, going as dark as it can go really early. The suicide rate among high functioning autistic people is rather high. I would question whether it's as high with so-called low functioning autistic people. It's extremely problematic to think that just because you have a lot of academic intelligence that the world is suddenly easy for you. I've actually known quite a few autistic people who, in their words, they wish they were more visibly disabled as an autistic person, not because for the sake of self-improvement or for anything to do with their own selves, but just so other people would stop judging them so much. So, yeah, imagine being treated so badly by the world that you wished you were, in their words, more disabled for the sake of other people's bad choices being changed. Yeah, so in some cases it might be because the down to disability. I have an autistic stepdaughter. She turned 14 last week, and she goes to a special school. On the one hand, yes, she has learning difficulties. On the other hand, I kind of hesitate before saying it because when she was 7, she had a reading age of 10. So it's like, am I supposed to call her high functioning or low functioning, or am I supposed to recognise that functioning labels are quite problematic? We should stop using them. Start talking about support needs rather than just how clever someone is or whatever. But yeah, we don't know whether or not she'll get a job when she's older, what employment might look like for her. But frankly, let's assume that everyone like Eliza will never get a job for the rest of their lives, etc. So let's go with the doom and gloom approach that we all know and love. Even if we went with all that, 16% is devastatingly low. And I don't think that casual ableism within the recruitment system towards people with learning disabilities is solely to blame for this figure being as low as it is. It's due to people like me not being able to get jobs either. Only 32% are in some kind of paid employment at all, part-time or full-time combined, compared with, and this is really interesting, 47% of disabled people in general and 80% of non-disabled people. So, yeah, it is no secret that the employment rates for the disabled population are woefully low, like 33 percentage points below the non-disabled population. So when I see that, I don't just think, oh, isn't the employment rates terrible for autistic people and also for disabled non-autistic people? I think, what is it about autism that apparently makes us so damn unemployable? And one of my answers to that is, well, I've got a bunch of answers. One of them is that if you are what people used to call mildly autistic, but basically, if you have my kind of autism, and you're in an environment where you're forced to struggle, you could say living in a world that is built for everyone else, for example, then you end up having people will have the same expectations of you that they will have of everyone else, but you will still struggle to meet them. I used to say, back when I used language like this, I used to say being mildly autistic means being non-autistic enough for people to have the same expectations of you, but just too autistic to match those expectations. I would no longer phrase it that way anymore because it's very clumsy language, but the point is pretty clear. So, yeah, what is it about autistic people, disabled or otherwise, that makes that rate so much lower than the disabled population in general? I'd say a lot of that is down to the recruitment system, and believe me, I will be going into some detail about the recruitment system. 77% of unemployed autistic people say they want to work. Again, this is not just not a case of people being too disabled or having too severe learning difficulties to work. It's also not about people not wanting to work. I mean, I'm pretty sure. I think someone needs to go on mute. Thank you. Uh, it's also not about people just want autistic people just want to stay in their comfort zones. I'm pretty sure that Eliza will want a job when she's older. She certainly doesn't want to live in mummy's house forever. She wants to either live independently or in supported living. So, yeah, autistic people with or without intellectual disabilities, they they'll often be quite ambitious. It's just whether or not the system we have allows them to achieve those ambitions, which they absolutely have. Now, I get the feeling that in quite a bit of what I'm saying here, I'm preaching to the choir because you will know just as well as I do. You will know better than me actually, exactly how ambitious autistic people can be, particularly those with intellectual disabilities, and how, yes, there are a lot of unemployed autistic people who absolutely have career ambitions and independence ambitions and so on. So, yeah, this, as well as being a depressing set of statistics, it does highlight exactly what the problem is, and also what the problem isn't. The problem is not necessarily that we're incapable of getting jobs. It's not necessarily that we don't want jobs. Frankly, the problem is other people. So, I can tell you a bit about my personal experience in trying to gain employment. Now, bear in mind that I am basically the what we used to call Asperger's, the Asperger's stereotype. I I I have a mathematics degree. I'm also a middle class white male. To be completely blunt about the biases that society holds, and also I can solve a Rubik's cube. So, it's, in fact, I remember that this party I went to, where someone who knew from church just this is some years ago, just asked me, "So, Chris, what method do you prefer when you're solving Rubik's cubes?" And I said, "Well, I've never solved a Rubik's cube in my life." He said, "Oh, well, I just kind of assumed that you did know how to because you just seem like that kind of person." I suppose I ended up thinking that, well, if I'm already matching the stereotype, then I might as well just learn how to do it. So, yeah, I enter speed cubing tournaments as well. What I'm saying is, I am one of those inspirational autistic people. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but one thing that I really, really do not like, and I'm just about to talk about what being autistic, an autistic job seeker was like in my 20s. I was really very miserable, and I had lots of struggles with anxiety. I did not have a very healthy self-perception. I defined myself by my weaknesses rather than by my strengths. And the thing is, the insights that I had back then are probably nearly as insightful as the ones I have now as a professional autistic advocate. The thing is, back then, no one really gave a shit what I thought. It's only now I've become an inspirational autistic person that people now care what I have to say. Back when I was a struggling autistic person, it's like, oh, bless. But now that I can speed solve Rubik's Cubes and I've given a talk at Sydney Opera House, which, yes, literally happened. Doesn't sound like the kind of thing that happened to me, but it's on YouTube, so I guess it must have happened. But yeah, the amount of times people use the I word to describe me, it's a little bit annoying. But one of the kind of subtopics about that's annoying is the fact that people didn't used to call me inspirational back when I had exactly the same insights, but I was struggling. So the lesson here is, if you blatantly do, if you know an autistic person who is struggling, who is trying to fight their way through a world built without them in mind, their insights are still absolutely worth listening to, whether or not the wider population would consider them inspirational, or whether they'd refer to them as a charity case. So, yeah, that was a bit of a tangent, but I felt it's. I do go off on a lot of tangents, by the way, but in my defense, I don't care. So, going back to what it was like for me, yeah, that's how the tangent started. Bear in mind, I am one of the autistic people who is supposed to find it easy, right? Because I'm clever. Yeah, well, I'm clever, but I'm still autistic in a world designed for non-autistic people. For example, Primary schools are filled with really bright colours because all children love bright, overwhelming colours. Really noisy playgrounds because all children love making loud noises. And oh yeah, we've got a surprise for you this afternoon because all children love surprises, no exceptions. And then you end up growing up and working in a workplace where everything from the physical setup of the office to the casual office backstabbing social politics, all of that was designed with the non-autistic workforce in mind. And the recruitment system, well, let me put it this way. My CV will tell you that I was a primary school teacher. That's one of the very first things I said to describe myself. What it won't tell you is that I got my first teaching job on the 13th interview. The other 12, well, half of them were silver medals because I was very good at persuading interview panels that my heart was in it. I'd worked extremely hard to build up children's love of learning and confidence and self-esteem. But there'd always be one other candidate who knew how to play the interview game and would just sit down and give the correct answers and tick all the boxes on the person's specification. And yeah, that kept me unemployed for quite a while. And yes, half of those 12 interviews were silver medals, but coming second in a job interview is kind of like coming second in the Hunger Games. For all the good it did, you might as well have come last. So it was both quite an encouragement and also quite devastating as well. Once in a while, I do need to remind myself of the person who I once told this story to, and at the end they said, "Wow, Chris, well done for carrying on going." And that made me think, oh yeah, I suppose that's true. When I tell this story, it's all about how much went wrong along the way. Sometimes I forget exactly how utterly determined I was back then to make my teaching career happen. So yeah, I'm a big fan of good things coming out of bad things. So it's perhaps worth me making an effort to remember exactly what positive attributes I had that allowed me to fight against this system long enough and being stubborn enough, because doesn't matter what people say, defiance and stubbornness can be positive human characteristics if they're used healthily. They certainly got me a job. So the thing is, during my experience of applying for jobs and getting rejected for jobs or getting interviews and then losing out on the jobs and so on, it felt very cyclical. What that meant was every time I would submit a job application, I was afraid of two things. Number one, not getting an interview because that would guarantee that it was yet another failure and I'd end up with nothing changing. The second thing I was afraid of was being invited for an interview, because then things would change. And it was very much a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario where I was afraid of both options. And yeah, one great thing about being self-employed is that I never have to apply for a job or go through an interview ever again. It felt so satisfying to say that sentence just now. But yeah, it isn't just it isn't just how stressful job interviews are, it's the stress of going through that cycle of rejection and also very nearly getting it. Oh, and also the self-fulfilling prophecies that come out as well, like how when I first started doing interviews, I wasn't really feeling very nervous about them until multiple bits of feedback told me how nervous I was during interviews. Then I started feeling nervous about whether I was going to appear nervous in interviews. So yes, that's ended up. But anyway, as you know how the story ends, I cracked it in the end. I finally kind of worked out how teaching interviews work and managed to get through them. So naturally, when I left teaching for the first time, I had to start completely again. So my original plan was to become a school business manager because, well, without going into a long description of a certain school that I and half the staff lost our jobs at because the school mysteriously found that there were £500,000 in deficit. Now, officially, nobody knows how. Officially. But yeah, I was temporary staff. They were looking to make my job permanent towards the end of the year. But despite being a teaching assistant who was also a qualified teacher and being a maths specialist in a school where maths was one of their main targets, my head was first on the chopping block because they didn't need to pay me any redundancy pay. So yeah, long story short, I have seen what happens to very good schools when the money runs out. So I thought, okay, so I don't want to be a teacher anymore, but I do want to be a positive influence in the lives of young people. What if I do that just by looking after the school's money? That indirectly is helping young people with their education. But the thing is about being a school business manager, you don't just go for a job interview and pass it. You need to start off at the very bottom rung, and you have to get like a filing job somewhere, which already requires you to have 2 years experience. Yeah, you need a job to get experience, experience to get a job. It was kind of like being 21 again, except not in a good way. So yeah, I did end up getting a job. It was a part-time job doing the filing in a mental health clinic. It was originally supposed to be the first rung on the ladder towards a career in being a school business manager. But the same week that I passed that interview, I launched this website called Autistic Not Weird. And the following Tuesday, I think it might have been 2 days before the interview, I gave my first talk for a company called McIntyre No Limits. And yeah, things kind of changed after that. But yeah, despite being a qualified and experienced primary school teacher with 2 university degrees by the point, I've since gained a third in creative writing, but I still took 4 attempts to pass an interview for a part-time filing job. Now, that's not because I'm stupid, and it's not because I'm terrible at answering interview questions. Well, okay, by their standards, I was, but you can hold a conversation with me. You can anyone who bothers to listen to me can hear and understand my insights about this, that, and the other. There's something about the design of the person specification which is generally, in fact, you know what? I've already gone off on plenty of tangents, and I'm probably quite behind on time, but I'm going to tell you this story anyway because I like it. There's only one time when I just opened up about being autistic in front of an interview panel. People ask me all the time. It's usually actually mothers of 18, 19-year-old autistic young adults who are going for their first job, and they contact me saying, should I tell their prospective employees they're autistic? And I say, well, why? But just let me know what's your reasoning behind that. And their answer is, I don't know, just say they know. And my answer is, okay, will that make them more likely to get the job or less likely to get the job? Yeah, I'm very kind of logical with my approach to these things. Should you disclose your autism on a CV while applying for a job? Well, if you're applying for a job with the National Autistic Society, I'd have to be extremely daft to not mention the fact that I'm autistic and have experience working with autistic people. But the role of a CV is to get you to the interview. That is it. So literally decide whether it's making me more likely or less likely to get, because you don't need to disclose any kind of, well, autism is considered a medical diagnosis. So you don't need to share anything that personal about you unless you specifically want to. Now, there will be some examples, like if Eliza gets a job interview, it would be sensible to let the interviewer know in advance that she'll need accommodations. But with someone like me, generally speaking, I didn't, except for this one time. So this is my 4th and final interview for a filing position, and this is the one I was just talking about, which happened a couple of days after I spoke for McIntyre. So the usual thing happened. There was a reading, writing, spelling, Microsoft Excel test, which I passed with flying colours for some reason. But then people walked in the room and started asking me questions, and the whole thing kind of went downhill from there. But the first question was a 2-parter. I mean, fair enough, but the 2 parts were completely different to each other. So I gave a very fluent answer to the first half of the question, and then sorry. And then I started to realize, you know what? If you do the same thing now as you did in the other 3 interviews, you're going to fail this interview. Was it Winston Churchill who's accredited as saying that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? So I thought, you know what, just for the sake of experimentation, I'm going to do it. I'm going to drop the A-bomb. I'm going to tell them I'm autistic and just see what happens. Yeah. I then paused and said, okay, I'm going to do something I've not done before, which immediately grabbed their attention. So I've got a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, as we called it back then. And what that means is I have basically the perfect kind of brain for this job. I'm organized, I'm logical. I've also got very autistic loyalty as well. And I have experience of being really organized with all with the everything and so on. And the way I finished this little speech was by saying, please don't interpret any shortcomings in my interview answers as being a reflection on how good I'd actually be at the job, because I do have the perfect kind of brain for this job. But answering interview questions is not really among my primary skill set. Turns out they admired my honesty and they gave me the job. Now, the moral of that story isn't tell people you're autistic. I'm not saying that, because I could have said, okay, I'm autistic, or if you want to phrase it negatively, I have autism. Yeah, I don't have autism. It's not a disease. I don't have left-handedness either. And I don't see my left-handedness as being such a negative that needs to be pushed to the back of the sentence like it's not a part of the real me. Oh, yeah. I could have said, I have autism, which means I'm terrible at this. I can't do that. I'm bad at that. But I'd be a really good employee, honest. Now, they wouldn't have been able to legally turn me down because of me mentioning that I'm autistic, but I'm worldly wise enough to know that there are plenty of other reasons why, with apologies, on this occasion, you did not match the person's specification. Yeah, disability discrimination is very rare in the sense that people actually say, this person's disabled, we're not having them, but it's probably very much alive and kicking in terms of people just not being given jobs for some other convenient reason. So, yeah, there was only one time when I told the interview panel I was autistic. It worked very much in my favor because I talked about my autism in a way that made me more likely to get the job, not less likely to get the job. So I now find it very, very ironic that I, of all people, frequently give talks on how to help fix the recruitment system and encouraging autistic people to get jobs, when I'm just about the least qualified person in terms of passing interviews. Anyway, why don't we get hired? Well, there's a couple of things, really. First off, there's a difference between being good at your job and talking about how good you are at the job. So, yeah, I'm not a natural show-off. In fact, I'm one of those people who, up until recently, when I kind of got over this barrier, I used to think that, okay, if you tell someone something good about yourself, you better tell them something bad about yourself as well, you know, for balance, and so you don't come across like a show-off. And it's only recently they've realised that, you know what, no, it's not showing off to just talk about the things that you're objectively good at. You could argue that solving a Rubik's Cube in front of an audience is showing off. I call it performance. And also, I think I was proving a point at the same time. Like sometimes when I do creative writing workshops in schools, the teacher will introduce me as, okay, the author who's coming to visit. And they'll say, okay, I'll say, okay, 1 second. They'll solve the Rubik's Cube, put it down, and they'll say, right, so I'm going to talk to you about how to open a story. And then later on, when we're talking about what an opening should do, I'll say, an opening should grab the reader's attention straight away. Do you remember right at the start when I solved this in front of you? Didn't that grab your attention? There was not a single person in the room who wasn't listening to me after I did that. So, yeah, if you do things like that, it's usually for a purpose rather than just showing off. The thing is, these days, I have the wisdom to, well, experience really rather than wisdom, but I can tell the difference between what is good old-fashioned showing off and what is objectively just talk about the things that you're good at with sober judgment. With that said, that took me quite a while and a lot of failed interviews as well. So there is also the fact that if you're going into an interview that is strictly a question and answer interview, then in my opinion, we shouldn't call those job interviews if it's literally just Q&A. We should call them spoken word beauty contests. That is the phrase that I think we need to adopt for job interviews, which is strictly Q&A, spoken word beauty contests. So, anxiety about non-autistic expectations is a big part of autism as well. So, you may have heard several autistic people telling you that being autistic is like playing a game where no one has bothered to tell you the rules. You're just expected to magically know the rules. I mean, how come you don't magically know these rules? Everyone else does. We're going to judge you if you don't know the rules. We're going to think of you as the awkward one. We're going to discriminate against you. We're going to act around you in a way that gives you mental health issues if you don't magically know these rules. So, yeah, add this to the fact that non-autistic expectations are not just really, really vague. I know plenty of non-autistic people who were very sympathetic towards me when I was failing interviews all over the place, who told me that, yeah, I struggle with interviews as well because I just can't really play the game when it comes to interviews. And these are people who are neurotypical as hell. Even they struggle with the expectations of an interview, and also telling someone as interview advice, just be yourself. That is very, very helpful advice if you are already the type of person for whom the interview system was built around. If I was just being myself in an interview, then I wouldn't meet the person specification. If someone who is already the kind of person who they give the job to anyway, if they're themselves, magically they will get the job. And as I mentioned earlier, the world is built with everyone else in mind. The recruitment process certainly is. Any job that just has a Q&A set up, the spoken word beauty contests, those are designed for those who already know how to play the interview game. I don't feel we need to go into much more detail about this because I think I've explained it to death. But yeah, those are some of the primary reasons why a lot of autistic people simply don't get hired. So how do we change this? Well, first of all, how about defining autistic people by their strengths? I will say, by the way, that a lot of the things that I'm mentioning in this slide are things that I say to employers. They may or may not be relevant to the roles that you play, but feel free to steal any of these insights next time you talk to an employer, or if you are perhaps visiting a prospective employer for one of your clients. Anyway, with that said, how about defining autistic people by their strengths? We are still trying to recover from decades of bad publicity when it comes to autistic people. And even now, pretty much the very first thing anyone learns about autism is it's supposed to be a bad thing. I mean, call me extremely biased, but no, I actually don't think it is. But that is, in terms of defining autistic people by their strengths, there is quite a dilemma within the autistic community. How do we talk about autism in a way that results in us being treated the way we need to be treated? Because on the one hand, if we only ever talk about how awesome autism is and how all these strengths we have and everything else, then you run the risk of people thinking, oh, right, so we don't need to provide any accommodations. In fact, they got it made. Why on earth would we change anything for them? So there's that. On the other hand, if you go down the routes that society has spent, I don't know, about as long as autism has been recognised as existing, and only talk about the weaknesses or the challenges that autistic people face, then yeah, you end up, well, with two things really. First off, autistic people feeling lesser, and secondly, people pinning the blame on autistic people or on autism rather than the society that is keeping autistic people back. So yeah, in my personal opinion, the right balance on talking about autism in a way that changes public perceptions is be open and honest about the strengths that we have, because we deserve to be seen by our strengths, and we do have a lot of strengths. Like I said to those people in that interview, but also be open and honest about the challenges, but don't talk about them in a way that A, ends up leading the autism conversation, or B, makes the autistic person feel lesser having heard these things about themselves. Secondly, recognize that those strengths do not necessarily apply to interview situations. Like I said earlier, told you a whole story about it. But when I give talks to employers, I often ask this very, very rhetorical question. If you were the head of a construction company, would you rather employ someone who's really good at building houses, or would you rather hire someone who is really, really good at talking about building houses? That is the situation you're in if you only have a Q&A situation. And so I'm thinking that the best way of improving the recruitment process is give your prospective candidates an opportunity to show the things that they would actually do in the actual job. I mean, teaching interviews, to their credit, sometimes they offered me a chance to answer questions from the school council or teach a 25-minute lesson. Now, this was good thinking on their part because it gave me an opportunity to prove that I could actually communicate with children. Of course, even that didn't 100% solve the problem because the general feedback was that, yeah, your lesson was excellent, you clearly get on very well with the children, but your answers during the interview stage, the Q&A stage, didn't hit all of the bullet points and so on and so on. So this does not solve everything, what I'm suggesting, but it goes a hell of a long way. It also changed the weighting of, as in WEIGH, to change the weighting of how many points on the person's specification can be met by various parts of the interview. So, yeah, the thing is, if you do that, then even if you remove autism, neurodivergence, disability, remove anything to do with inclusion from the conversation, even if you do that, you do what I suggested. If you reshape job interviews so that the person will get a chance to do what they would actually be doing in the job, you will get better employees anyway. As the saying often goes, if you accommodate disabled people, you accommodate everyone. And also, don't look for excuses to not hire. And yes, this is the thing that I say directly to employers. Sometimes disability discrimination is quite blatant. Sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes it is subconscious. One analogy I use when talking about this topic is literary agents. So while I was trying to get Underdogs published, I knew exactly how much of a challenge I was up against because I knew a couple of literary agents who were quite open about the fact that they received literally thousands of manuscripts from wannabe authors every year, like literally thousands. And every year they take on 3 or 4 new clients. So if you arrive at your desk as a literary agent in the morning, and the clients you already have, there's a lot of work that needs doing for them, but also you have, 3,000 or 4,000 divided by 300 working days. You've got a lot on your plate. You read that pile, you're looking for a reason to just get to the next one. And I remember this one particular teaching job that I got an interview for where they were quite open about the fact that I reached the last 8 out of 96 applicants. And I have no doubt that when they're reading that list of 96 applicants, they were looking for reasons to not hire. Now, that might not look like, this person's autistic, I don't like autistic people. It might be fear of accommodations. Because, but if you've not delivered accommodations before, you might be worried about, costings for starters. There was this one speaker, as manager of a disabled employee for BBC, who once saw giving an interview. Who once saw giving a talk about employment interview situations and so on. And he said something that's stuck with me ever since. He said, by the way, if the autistic person's employer says, oh, we can't do that, it's not in our budget, the next thing to ask is, okay, what are your costings? Because almost all of the time, they won't have researched it. They'll just be saying offhand, oh, we don't have the budget for it, and you'll just be expected to believe them. And I was sat there listening to them thinking, this never once in my life has it occurred to me to actually question what are the specific costings. So remember that for as long as I have, because it's quite something. So people will make offhand assumptions that we don't have the budget for this, or it would change too many things in the office, because a lot of non-autistic employers don't like change. They're very rigid in their thinking like that. So, the moment you learn something about something that makes them different, people do subconsciously run the risk of having that lingering doubt in their mind. And when you're down to the last 15 and you need to narrow it down to 10, sometimes if you can't pick any specific faults, it comes down to, I just kind of have a feeling, you know. Yeah. By the way, the worst feedback I've ever had from an interview, not in terms of my performance, but the feedback I could learn the least from was a special school that I had an interview at, and their reasons for hiring someone else before me was, well, it was just kind of a feeling of who fits, you know. You couldn't really have done anything better. It's just gone really well with another person, and that. So yeah, people do go on feelings rather than facts, and rather than evidence, and it's annoying. It is how people are, I'm afraid. But yes, the thing that I say about accommodations is that it's not a word to be afraid of, because A, any accommodations you give to an autistic and or disabled employee is not going to break the back of your organization, and B, the accommodations you provide will be more than worth it for the performance you get as a result of it. So all of that's quite good, but what about when we actually get a job? So how are we doing for time? Yeah, actually not doing as badly for time as I thought we were. So anyway, let's go through this. First off, let's use our own methods and go at our own pace. Now, those who have heard me speaking before may have heard this story a couple of times before, and those who follow me on YouTube may have seen the animated version of this story, which I'm about to tell. So, yeah, does anyone here remember the story about the football match against the Scouts? Okay, so this may be new to a lot more people than other thoughts. So, yeah, funny story. So, first off, has anyone here heard of the Boys Brigade? To be fair, we can't actually see everyone. Okay, out of the 4 people I can see on my
So they
screen.
didn't
Right
realise he
to
was-
work.
Yeah, they didn't
Has
realise.
he got the right to be
Sorry,
in the country?
Well, he must do. He must.
Karen, hello, hi,
Karen.
welcome, but please keep. Thank you. Right, so yeah, the Boys Brigade. For those who haven't heard of the Boys Brigade, we are the people who invented the Scouts and taught the Scouts how to go camping. Their marketing department is a lot bigger than ours, so they're a lot bigger than us now. But well, yeah, I don't feel bitter about that at all. Nice bit of autistic sarcasm there, but yeah, we're a Christian youth organisation. We're founded in 1883, and we do provide for girls as well. It's just back in 1883, it was the boys who got the services. But I'm company captain of my local Boys Brigade and Girls Association, or BB for short. Anyway, so when I was 8 years old, our Boys Brigade club had a football match against the Scouts. So already there was quite some tension there. And also there seemed to be this tradition in my village where all the geeky, nerdy kids like myself joined the Boys Brigade and all of the sporty kids joined the Scouts. So we were going to get slaughtered. And and I asked if I could be in goal. I'd never been in goal before, but it just kind of looked interesting. So so there was, stood in front of the goal wearing my friend's goalkeeper gloves. And turns out I was actually really good. As long as I didn't use my hands, I was really good. Now you may be wondering, hold on, in fact, I can see a couple of confused faces already. So how on earth can you be a good goalkeeper without using your hands? Well, it's simpler than you think. You basically just boot the ball to the other end of the field. You then wait a few minutes for the Scouts to come back, then you tackle them and you boot it to the other end of the field. Then a few minutes later, they'll get past your useless defenders again, then you tackle them and you boot it to the other end of the field. You keep doing this and you keep doing this, and honestly, it works. And it ended up being a few minutes away from full time, and the score was 0-0. And that would have been an amazing result for us, because we knew that we weren't going to score any goals. We weren't that kind of team. But getting a draw against the Scouts would have been just incredible. Except I was then pulled to one side by a grown-up who knew better. And I was told, in no uncertain terms, Chris, well, I was probably Christopher back then, but you have to bend down and pick up the ball using your hands, otherwise your team is going to lose. You're not following the standard expected method that goalkeepers obliged to, paraphrasing, obviously, but the message was quite clear. I was doing things wrong and I needed to change and follow the expected method, otherwise bad things would happen. So I spent the last 5 minutes bending down, trying to pick up the ball, and we lost 4-0. Yeah, guess who got the blame for that? I would like to think that the moral of that story is quite obvious, but well, maybe people think differently, we should let them do things differently. And this applies in the workplace as well. I do also have quite a bit to say about how it works in teaching as well. When I was standing up in front of my class of 5 autistic teenagers, I took great pride in saying that there are about half a dozen different ways of getting the answer to this question right, and within reason, I don't care which method you use. Your brain, your methods. I did have to use the phrase within reason because very literal-minded autistic teenagers who love taking the piss will think, okay, 99 plus 1, let's do 99 tally marks here, 1 tally mark here. Now let's count them up. 1, 2, 3. You said we could use any method, Chris. So yeah, within reason. But yeah, that was a luxury that I didn't have when I was a primary school teacher, because Ofsted have had a bit of a bad rap this week, haven't they? And yeah, most of my talks include me going off on one about Ofsted. Now, yeah, I'll try and keep it short because it's an emotional time for people connected to the teaching profession. What I usually say about Ofsted is that they are very good at singing the song and dancing the dance of, we're different and diverse and unique, and isn't it wonderful? But no, every single student needs to learn this particular method for multiplication and division. And then a few years later, they'll change their mind and they'll invent this new and improved version, which suddenly every teacher has to teach every child. Then a few years later, they'll go back to the old one, which is the current new and improved version. And I used to go on a bit of a bit of a rant about Ofsted to my students. And I remember this one particular rant where I said, you think if Ofsted changed their minds enough times, wouldn't they eventually just get it right? And to which one of my students said, yeah, Chris, it's kind of like if you have plastic surgery enough times, eventually it'd stop looking ugly. Wow. I'm going to let you have that one. That was actually pretty good. There was a lot of that. This is another reason why I love special education. If someone had said that to me in a mainstream secondary school, I would have had to go full on authoritative mode and all the punishments. And clearly this teenage lad had been in schools where he had been treated like that. But with me and them in a close-knit school, first name terms, and so we all just got each other. Everyone in the room was autistic as well, so we kind of shared a sense of humor to some extent. And also they got as good as they gave. I took the mick of them just as much as they took the mick of me, and it was glorious for everyone involved. We were a very close-knit group of people, largely because we knew what the boundaries were. In fact, it was very useful for teaching them what the boundaries were for banter and humour and things. But I digress. So, whether it's me playing football, or whether it's students at schools, or whether it's people in the workplace, autistic people, people in general, should be allowed to use the methods that work for them. I've heard that one of the most damaging things that a company can say for itself is, but that's the way we've always done it. So, yeah, if you have someone who has a completely atypical, weird way that doesn't make sense to you, but they get the job done better than they would if they were using the expected method, then let them do it. Their brain is the only brain it needs to make sense to. Number 2, be specific without being patronizing. Now, this one applies to just in general talking to autistic people. It applies to you directly within your roles. It is no secret that the whole taking things literally thing is quite real, and in fact, it's hilarious. I could tell you so many stories about how many times I've taken things literally when apparently I wasn't supposed to take things literally, or people dropped hints and then again, sometimes it's quite painful as well, the amount of hints that people have just expected me. In fact, last night on Autism Not Always Facebook page, I just happened to upload a meme that said, I'm autistic, which means I have this communication disorder where other people don't say what they mean and I get blamed for it. Yeah. So the more specific and sincere you can be with the autistic people in your lives, the better we will match your expectations. So, you know what? Yes, I'll say it because we are actually doing fairly well for time. I'm going to tell you the story about my first date. So, me and yeah, I can see Belinda and Sonny smiling already. I don't know whether you've heard this before. If you have, then it's worth enjoying twice. And also, I've got another animated version of it on YouTube as well. But here's the story. So, me and this new girl, when we were 17, uh, we're in sixth form, so we went out to the pub between lessons for a pub lunch, and she had this crazy idea that I was supposed to pay for her food as well as mine. And yeah, I know it's ridiculous. But do you think she told me? Well, the thing is, in her mind, she probably believed that she had told me. After all, she looked at her menu and said, Chris, I'm not sure if I've got enough money to pay for my food and for the bus home. Which I heard and interpreted as she hasn't got enough money to pay for her food and for the bus home. Now, call it my communication disorder, but I'm pretty sure that's what she said. But yeah, apparently that was her way of asking me to pay for her food. It's like some years ago, I heard my mum saying, Chris, apparently it's going to be sunny all day today. And that was her way of saying, Chris, please put the washing out. I mean, what the hell? So yeah, obviously I didn't get what the new girlfriend was saying, so she was somewhat less than satisfied with my answer of, oh, don't worry, cheesy chips are only 1.75. Now I know what you're thinking. £1.75 is a great price for cheesy chips, but this was in 2003. I'm afraid that those days are gone. But uh, yeah, she was not very happy. I didn't find out for another 4 months when our mutual friends told me that she hadn't been happy because apparently that's how non-autistic people communicate. But yeah, apparently she wasn't happy. So yeah, hints don't work. Say what you mean what you say. And another point I often make is that the English language is reputed to have more than 1 million words in it. I don't know whether or not it actually does, but it certainly has at least a couple of 100,000. Now, there will be some combination of words that will allow you to say what you mean what you say, but say it in a supportive and non-judgmental way. It also, to some extent, depends on the relationship you have with that person. For example, let's say, an autistic teenager who hasn't put on deodorant and they're starting to stink. Now, if that happens to me, my dad might say, Chris, you stink a bit. And that's fine because that is the relationship that me and my dad have. It could also be the mum who says, oh, Chris, just so you know, I don't think anyone else has noticed, but you might want to put on some deodorants. That is a fine way of phrasing as well, because that is the reflective of the relationship I have with my mum. So, yeah, base it around the kind of relationship you have with the actual autistic person. But what you need to do just in general is be authentic in what you say and don't give them stuff to read between the lines because, well, sometimes they don't even recognize there's spaces between the lines where apparently there's bonus content. So, oh, and you may have also noticed the other half of that without being patronizing. I remember a special school I worked in. It was midway through my first teaching career, but it was in a special school between me having jobs as a mainstream primary school teacher. I was a teaching assistant in a special school, and there was this teacher who would bear in mind that this is a class of 14, 16-year-olds, autistic students who were doing their GCSEs but needed extra accommodations for it. She would explain the task to the class, set them off on the task, and then she turned to me and give the instructions again with the same slow voice and intonations that she taught the disabled students with. I was a qualified primary school teacher with a mathematics degree by this point, but hey, autism, that's how you talk to autistic people, all of us. So, yeah, if I find myself in the same room at the same time as an autistic person with a processing delay, I won't change anything about the general manner in which you communicate. I'll talk a little bit slower, for example, you've been listening to me for nearly an hour now. You know the speed at which I generally talk. If I were talking to someone who has a processing delay, I might talk at this speed instead. But I haven't really changed the intonation of my voice. All I'm doing is speaking a little bit slower, a few pauses once in a while in my sentences, but I am behaving like the same person that I am. I promise I will never be like a certain person who he just turned 12. This 12-year-old client of mine in California who went to a university to be part of this autism study, and the person who greets him by saying, "Hello, it's so lovely to meet you." And he was 11 years old by this point. And also living with PTSD that was given to him by his mainstream school, where people spoke to children like that. So yeah, that was not only patronizing but also kind of triggering as well. But yeah, after a quick word from his mum, this person stopped talking to this lad like that and started talking to him like an actual human being. So yeah, be specific, say what you mean what you say, but don't be patronizing about it, and also don't be inauthentic about it. The thing that I really don't like about the people who go, "Hello, it's so good," and so on, is the fact that they're clearly not like that in real life. There's a subset of primary school teachers who I call goodness me teachers. Now, the reason I call them goodness me teachers is because they are the kind of people who will express their surprise at the behavior of a 6-year-old child by saying, "Goodness me," when really no one in real life has unironically used the phrase "goodness me" since the 1950s. But yeah, it just stinks of inauthenticity, really. Whereas my students knew exactly who it was. They knew exactly how I communicated. The only difference was that I swore less. I would still say what I mean. I'd still express myself in almost exactly the same way. I'll just phrase it slightly differently in accordance with their needs. So I think I've talked enough about that, but I will show you a couple of pictures that kind of drive the point home about the importance of being specific and things. Actually, you know what? No, before I do that, I will talk to you a little bit about the fact that there are idioms out there that we think are literal, but they are not. Have any of you realized how disgusting it is when you change your mind? Now, that has changed your mind. And I did not realize until I was 10 years old when I read it in a Sonic the Hedgehog comic and thought, "Oh, wait, what?" And yeah, we think that it's not an idiom. We think it's literal, but it's not. There's a bunch of them, like "you've never caught the sun," "you're never all ears," and "please never, ever tell me to keep my eyes peeled." Because I hate that phrase so much. And there's also an example of back when Eliza was, I think she was 8, 9 years old. It was the middle of the summer holidays, and so Julie, my partner, Eliza's mother, wasn't particularly bothered about when the children go to bed. So when it was around 9 o'clock, she turned to Eliza and said, "Eliza, do you want to go to bed yet?" And Eliza said, "No." And Julie said, "Okay, do you want to stay up for a while?" And she went, "No." "Okay, what would you like to do?" "I want to stay down for a while." Because the bedroom's upstairs. When we say stay up for a while, we have no idea that we're actually using an idiom. It was like in this school I briefly did some teacher training at. There was this totally, as far as I'm aware, totally non-autistic boy who, when I said, "Yeah, can you quickly go through that door and ask Mrs. Smith something?" He looked at me and said, "How do you go through a door?" That's a good point. Now, these pictures, imagine how an autistic child might read this sign. Now, I don't know how many disabled, elderly, pregnant children there are, but when I was 8 years old, if I read this, I probably would have just held it in. And then there's this one, which is, it was shown by the father of a, yeah, that's it. He was 9 years old, a 9-year-old autistic child who ran up to him and said, "Daddy, Daddy, my toy is racist," because it said this. So yeah, punctuation matters. And also, it's written in capital, so it must be really important to keep it away from children made in China. So yeah, the main learning points here, the more specific and sincere you can be with autistic people, the better we will match your expectations, but at the same time, be authentic and non-patronizing about it. Now, two more points to go. First off, the things you don't notice might really impact us. Like I said earlier, I'm quite fortunate in the sensory department. So I am one of the, by the way, I think one of the reasons why schools and workplaces are quite slow to accommodate the sensory needs of autistic people is because if things don't impact us personally, then we just don't really think about them. And that's not really a selfishness thing. It's just kind of urology. In fact, right now, you are not thinking of polar bears. Well, now you are because you just mentioned polar bears, but right up until now, you weren't even thinking of it. So unless things are consciously put in our minds, we just don't think of them. So even I, despite training teachers and employers and everyone else about all this, even I, as a teacher, occasionally had to remind myself consciously, wait, is this person not engaging because the lights are buzzing or because the room's too bright or too loud or something? So yeah, sometimes we do have to physically remind ourselves of that. And I also mentioned earlier that the physical setup of the office is one of the things that is designed for the wider population. This job that I had doing filing for the NHS, that was quite lovely because it was me in a room with all the files, and that was it. Me, computer, files. It was a stereotypical autistic person's paradise. But also, it was right next door to the reception office with 3 other staff members in there. So anytime I wanted to have my social needs met, I could just pop out the office and talk to people. It worked quite well. There was one day where they said, "Oh, Chris, would you mind doing some hot seating?" Like, no. Whoever invented hot seating, I'm not much in the way of much of a supporter of corporal punishments, but I'm thinking maybe a light custodial sentence might be in order. But yeah, hot seating, as in here's a desk with one seat in it. Everyone takes turns to use that seat. So yeah, that's an autistic person's nightmare. Because if I'm sat at a desk, I wouldn't be thinking, okay, let's do some work. I'd be thinking, okay, what do I not do at this desk? I mean, I don't like the way these are organized, but if I organize it, is such and such going to start leaving passive aggressive notes about please don't move the things. There's just so many unspoken social expectations to think about that you're actually not doing the work. It's kind of similar to school, really, where an anxious autistic child, one of their reasons for not learning is because they're on survival mode. They're not going to take a break from their fears of being judged by other people to, yeah, I'll just push my fears one side a moment and access the learning. Yeah, they're not going to do that. They're going to stay on survival mode. So, and finally, ask us what helps. Oh yeah, and believers as well. But I can't remember whether or not you're about to see this quote, because after this, I've got a few quotes from the followers to share with you. One that's really stuck with me was when someone mentioned in a thread about accommodating autistic people in the workplace. What would you like employers to know? This person said, well, the thing is, autistic people are quite good at being honest. We're just not good at being believed. And yes, unfortunately, you will get employers who this might be subconscious again, but they'll hear an autistic employee saying, okay, I'm struggling, I need this accommodation. And one of their first thoughts might be, okay, yes, we've heard you, we've listened to you, but is there a way we could not do that? Often people are quite resistant to change, especially if it's if they think that if we've got to accommodate one person, we've got to accommodate the rest of the staff as well, and it's not fair. No, let me tell you what's not fair. The fact that the system is already accommodating everyone else. You accommodating an autistic or disabled employee is not giving them special treatment. It's allowing them the same access that everyone else is given by default. It's only when the person's autistic or disabled or has some kind of disadvantage that the others don't have. It's only them that you start calling it accommodations. If you accommodate everyone else, it's called just the way we do things here. But if it's a minority group, it's called accommodations. And often people are quite self-righteous about it. It's portrayed as an act of kindness that these autistic employees, employees with autism, are getting accommodated by us because we know how to treat our employees well. I'd say if you truly knew how to treat your employees well, then you wouldn't even call it accommodations. You just allow them to access things on their terms by just the way your office runs. If, of course, they work in an office, it applies to all workplaces. But yeah, I also make the point where, and this also applies to schools. It also applies to McIntyre. It works for anyone who works in any capacity with autistic people. Don't assume that what worked with your last autistic employee or your last autistic client will automatically work for the next one. There will be schools out there who will provide reassurance to the parents of a 4-year-old autistic boy who's just about to start school by saying, "Don't worry, we know all about autism. We had an 11-year-old autistic girl leave us last year." There might be a bit of a difference between the 4-year-old boy and the 11-year-old girl, autism or otherwise. And also there is the little inconvenient fact that it'll be so convenient to the rest of the world if all autistic people could just be treated the same. But unfortunately, we do have our own perspectives, our own opinions, our own life experiences, and we are different to each other for the same reason that non-autistic people are different to each other. And I often say, never trust anyone who claims to have all the answers for how to accommodate all autistic people, which is why this point is so important. Ask us what helps us. I could give you a chapter and verse on what helps me. In fact, I'm pretty sure I have. But it may or may not apply to the next autistic person you run into. Not literally run into, but that's another idiom that we think is not literal, that we think is literal, but actually isn't. So, yeah, if an autistic employee or an autistic client prefers to receive instructions by email, then send them instructions by email. Don't rely on spoken word being enough. If they say, I work better in the corner of the room because if I work in one of those terrible places with 100 people in the same room all working in cubicles, sticking me in the middle of that is overwhelming, then find them a place in the corner. Make them swap places with someone in the corner who doesn't have those sensory needs. And more than anything else, I tell employers, create an environment where the autistic employee can be honest. Now, you all know as well as I do that masking is a thing. The stereotype is that autistic people can't lie. Well, it's not that we can't lie, it's that we struggle with insincerity. But we can lie, and often we will fulfill our duty to lie to people. If people say, "How are you?" and we're actually not doing very well at all, we will still fulfill our duty to lie and say, "I'm fine, thanks, how are you?" because we are taught how to do that. But an example of how this may apply to the workplace is, let's say that an autistic person is struggling, so very high masking. And then an employer who has up until now provided no evidence that they're willing to accommodate the autistic person's needs says, "Oh, well, you're doing okay, aren't you? But there isn't anything really you need to change." What answer is the autistic employee likely to give if they are high masking? "Oh, yeah, sure, I'm fine." If you really want productive answers to how to improve your service for autistic clients or the environment for autistic boys or your schools for autistic children, create the environment where they don't feel the duty to lie to you and give you the answer that they think you want, the answer that will keep them out of trouble the best. You create an environment where they know they can be honest, you will get the honest answers, and you in turn will be able to accommodate them better. So to finish off with, some time ago, there was a thread on Autistic.Weird, and I asked, what do you want people to understand about being autistic in the workplace? And it was such a great thread that I basically saved it, and I copy-pasted a bunch of their insights here. So to finish, here are some comments from because remember what I said a couple of minutes ago, never trust anyone who claims to have all the answers for all autistic people. I do feel a kind of civic duty as an autistic advocate to talk about autistic people who aren't me or Eliza or people who worked. Actually, yeah, come to think of it, I talk about loads of different autistic people, not just myself. Nonetheless, here's a bunch more people. So it's not all about making the autistic person fit the work environment, but how the workplace can change to fit the autistic person, and how those changes actually help all their employees, and to make changes without waiting for a special accommodation request. Yeah, I said earlier in the talk that if you accommodate autistic and or disabled people, you're accommodating everyone else. And just while reading that first sentence, it is just triggered a memory of a Facebook meme that I saw a while ago, where it says, "If a flower is struggling to grow, then you change the environment that you planted the flower in. You don't try to change the flower." It's the same with people, but well, we are still recovering from the very 20th century attitude that if only autistic people could change to become more normal and less defective and stuff. But that's a rant for another time. If you ask our opinion, I love how they finish this quote. If you ask our opinion, you will get an honest answer. If you just want to be told your idea is great, it is best to ask someone who knows how to lie. Yeah. One of my godsons, autistic, he was my beta reader for a bunch of the Underdogs books. And he is, as much as I love him, he is not the most emotionally literate person, and he's not great at team working because, well, he's 18 now. He is learning, but at school it was very much, well, why is this person being offended that I told their idea is stupid? I'm right. Their idea is stupid. I'm just telling them the truth. How are they getting offended when I'm just telling them the truth? So yeah, the reason I raise him in conversation is because me and him have the kind of relationship where he will tell me if some of the things in the Underdogs series is completely wrong or inaccurate. One of his special interests is military history and, well, not just history, like present day military stuff. So he was the ideal beta reader for Underdogs. You could guarantee he would not say, "Oh, it's fine. I can't think of any improvements really." He would just tell me all of the things that I've got wrong. And he takes some pride in doing so as well. Thankfully, he knows me well enough to know that if he tells me these things, I won't be offended. I will find it useful. And all these things are kind of said with love as well. He's never told me that he loves me, but he clearly does. But he would never use the word. He shows his love for me through ripping the shit out of all the stuff that I've spent loads of work on, because he knows he's helping. He knows that I accept the help very gratefully. But yeah, a bunch of this is also down to relationships, and yeah, autistic people can be very, very helpful if you're willing to deal with being told things that might make you uncomfortable, but necessary truths. Here's one: just because you appear to be doing fine or never seem to have a problem before doesn't mean you are, and doesn't mean you didn't. Highly intelligent people, without noticeably different ways of moving or speaking, can still be autistic in the same way that more noticeably autistic people are. It truly can be an invisible disability. Yeah, that's phrased rather well. I'm not sure what I have to add to that. It's except there was. I think pretty sure half my brain is Facebook memes, because every time I read a sentence, it triggers a memory of a Facebook meme. This one is one that I made, where I pointed out a few weeks ago. It is hypocritical to say not all disabilities are visible if you're also saying, no, what do you mean they're struggling? They're high functioning. They can't possibly have any problems. There is some hypocrisy between the two. So we will likely need accommodations, but when the right support is in place, we will be a massive asset to your team. Just because we think differently doesn't mean we don't make great employees. It just means we do great differently. Things back to what I said about allowing autistic people to use their own methods, whether they're in school, whether they're working with you, or whether they're working with in gainful employment later on, whether they're volunteering or whatever. Allow people to do great differently. Always assume positive intent. Usually autistic people don't have underlying motives, like non-autistic people. Yeah, little bits stereotyping there, but I am faithfully representing what their views are. So if we don't respond how you expect, then don't assume we have an agenda. We are probably just being misunderstood. Yeah, because autistic people communicate a little bit differently, and non-autistic people can often sense when they're being communicated to a bit differently. Often people's defense mechanisms will lead us to assume, does that person have an ulterior motive? Well, most of the time, no, we don't have an ulterior motive. We're just blunt. It's important to be clear about expectations and not assume that we will pick things up from context or because it's normal workplace etiquette. It's the way we've always done things here. Also, be aware of situations where it's just assumed that information will be relayed across the workforce. If someone is a bit isolated at work, this may not happen for them. Yes, I've mentioned that I had a separate office to the rest of the staff team, and I was part-time as well. Thankfully, basically everything that needed to be communicated to me was communicated to me, with a couple of slip-ups here and there, but then again, people are human. It wasn't standard practice that I'd be left out of things. But yeah, when this person says a bit isolated at work, I don't think they just meant physically isolated, like me in a separate office. They might be socially isolated. And honestly, people are less likely to say things to people who they don't personally like, even if it is work-related and they're supposed to. And I think this is the last one. Yes, this is the last one. Know that instructions will be understood literally. So if you want me to do X, Y, and Z, you need to tell me to do X, Y, and Z. If you only tell me to do X and assume I'll understand that you mean Y and Z to be a natural part of doing X, I'll only understand that you want me to do X. That was a very nice way of phrasing it, I think. It's a very autistic way of phrasing it, but it does summarize quite brilliantly how hints can be used in the workplace, just because, well, that's the way things are done here. The more specific and sincere you can be with autistic people, the better we will match your expectations, as I've said a number of times now, actually. So yes, in conclusion, now I know that McIntyre No Limits is a charity. It's a very good charity in my experience. Does a lot of good for a lot of people, and although even then, I'd like to finish this by saying what I often say to employers, that we as a society need to get past this state of thinking that if you do something nice for an autistic person, it's a charitable effort or something. And yeah, it's always tricky making that point in front of McIntyre, who are literally a charity, but I'd like to think that you know what I mean. It's kind of like there was a time last year when I was selling books at an event that had nothing to do with autism. So the people who are looking at my books were members of the general population. And I remember this one guy. This is a nice guy, by the way. I'm not painting him as some kind of horrible, nasty, ableist person. I think he's just a general reflection of the general public. Very nice guy. Came up to me and asked me what Underdogs was about. I told him it was about a bunch of neurodivergent heroes from a special school fighting water for the general population. And he said, "Oh, sounds really interesting. Is it for charity?" And no, I'm an author by trade. This is part of how I make my money. And I didn't, he seemed nice, so I didn't want to go on a full rant about, well, actually, it is possible to write stories about autistic people without there being some kind of philanthropic purpose for it, or some kind of charity thing. I've published a book about autism before where people ask me what I was doing with the proceeds. Because the only way you can talk about autism in books is if there's some kind of charitable effort about it, surely. And again, it's a reflection of wider society's assumptions. And you know me well enough to know that I'm not saying, oh, there's not much of a place for, because frankly, charities do amazing work for autistic people, including yours. But I do not like the fact that people often think that autistic representation should only be in charities or for charitable purposes. And the reason I raise this is because of a point that I make to charities and to employers when talking about autism and employment. We need to get past the phase where employing an autistic and or disabled person is seen as kind of an act of charity. It's something being nice. Let's give this disabled lad a go. Autistic people are worth hiring for entirely legitimate reasons, and they should be hired for legitimate reasons, no longer just as an act of charity. But those are the main things I'd like to say about autism and employment. Thank you very much for having me back for a seventh time. Looking forward already to number 8. And yeah, I'll end this with the same sentence as I finished my speech with when I talked at your AGM last year. If the talk that I just gave helps just one of you or helps just one of your autistic clients, then I'm going to be bitterly disappointed because I'm actually hoping for more than that. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Chris. That was really good. I could see so many smiles on people.